Hello and welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Kat and I'm an editor at RM, having previously been a teacher for a number of years and also being a Senko. So today I'm really excited and I get the absolute pleasure of introducing David Bartram, OBE, for his keynote session with us. So in this keynote, we're going to be hearing from David, who is a SEND strategic leader. And David has led special educational needs and disability provision in London schools for over 15 years. He worked closely with the Department for Education to develop SEND policy and was an expert advisor to the Timpson Review on school exclusions. David has worked directly with over 400 school leadership teams across the UK to improve their provision for disadvantaged children. David is also the author of the SEND Review Guide, a national framework funded by the DfE that's been downloaded by 5,000 schools. He was the director of SEND at the London Leadership Strategy, an advisor to the Mayor of London's education team. David's a consultant for the British Council, and as part of this work, he's supported the development of SEND policy in a number of countries, including Ethiopia, Seychelles, Thailand, and Malaysia. And it's also a trustee of the KPMG Foundation, which seeks to bring about systematic change in businesses and society and unlock the potential of the most disadvantaged children in the UK. David was awarded an OBE for services to special education in the 16 New Year's Honours list. So today, David's going to be talking to us about leading great SEND provision to ensure progress for all. Throughout the session, if you do have any specific questions, which I'm sure there'll be lots, please do type them into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom right of your screens, and we'll try to answer as many as we can towards the end of the session. So I personally have been really looking forward to this session and hearing David's insights and advice. So enough from me, and I will now hand over to David.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks everyone so much for joining the session this afternoon. Really appreciate how busy everybody is and finding the time. So I really appreciate that. And rather embarrassingly, in some of the literature that was going out, it was saying that I was a world influential SEND strategist in the bio. I can assure you that it's not the case. I'm not even the best teacher in my house. My wife's absolutely brilliant. It was actually last night that I was at the dinner table. I was doing a little bit of work, and I said to the kids, I've got quite an important talk today. My son said, well, Dad, bit of advice, just don't take yourself too seriously. And my daughter said, yeah, Dad, don't tell any jokes because, you're just not really that funny. So after that really great sort of vote of confidence from my own children, I wanted to share with you just some of the things that I've seen across, 500-600 schools, I suppose, over the last 10 years or so. I'm a bit of a sort of a one-trick pony. It's about the only thing SEN provision in schools that I really know anything about. And what I wanted to say as well, particularly as we go through the presentation, is that there's absolutely no perfect model of SEN provision anywhere. Could have approached this presentation in a number of different ways. I've tended to focus it, I think, really on looking at the importance of strengthening leadership, the importance of drawing on evidence as much as we can in terms of our work. But absolutely no perfect way of delivering SEN provision in schools, I don't think. So the theme throughout the talk this afternoon, which I think is about 45 minutes or so, is very much going to be really around just trying to do a few things well, not doing too much stuff, but actually trying to keep things as simple and as achievable as possible in terms of our work if we're really going to ensure progress for all of our pupils. And that's about, I think, sort of trying to prioritise the things for you and the learners in your own school that really are going to have the biggest impact. Sometimes it can be easy to write action plans with 50, 60 things on. It can be harder to really sometimes distill down some of the key things that are going to make the biggest difference for the pupils in our school. Just like to stare at this image for a moment. I have put together some GIFs and things, but it wasn't quite working, so we're gonna have to skip those as we go through. But I'd like just to stare, if it's okay, at that image for a moment, and just what's the first thing that you notice when you look at that? Just have a look at that for a moment. What's the first thing that you see? And people have seen different things when they look at it. Some will see someone, like a man running into the forest. Others see like a dog that's running out of the forest. And people take on different perspectives, different ways of looking at things. And never more so, I think, are there different perspectives and different ways of looking at the delivery of SEN provision in schools, and particularly sometimes, those different perceptions on what our children with SEN and learning difference can achieve in our schools. I started off my own personal career as a teaching assistant in a large secondary school in West London. And for me, incredible to see the wildly different expectations of exactly the same class from different teachers as they went from classroom to classroom, and often sometimes going in and once again in the geography lesson, the same word search that was put out, similar, that sort of that same approach for the kids. Whereas actually the Senko, Greta Armitage, who absolutely inspired me to become, a Senko for sort of 15 years or so in the end, was absolutely, in terms of those aspirations for those children, ensuring that, that she pushed them in terms of what they were able to achieve regarding their literacy, their numeracy, and so on. So I think when it comes to trying to ensure that, all of our children achieve to their very best in our schools, we have to believe that our kids with SEN are going to achieve well, that they're going to progress well. And of course, belief alone on its own is not enough. But if we don't at least believe that, actually very quickly, it can sometimes be seen as or become the child's fault. And obviously that is not something that we're wanting to happen. So I've just shared some fairly sort of concerning outcomes on a national scale, really, at the moment, at a sort of macro level, and we need to address some of the inequity that exists for some of our pupils with SEN at the moment. And at a micro level, there's a challenge for us here, isn't there? How can we ensure that the decisions that we make at a school level don't mirror some of the mistakes of the past, but contribute collectively to better outcomes for children with SEN in our schools? And I certainly, don't know what the future is going to hold necessarily when it comes to great SEN provision and the future of SEN provision, but just to share some of those challenges with you globally. Actually, we are seeing some improvements when it comes to access, but also in terms of engagement of our children attending school. You will see from that, the significant number of children who are not even in school at the moment, and the challenges that they will face. So as an approach, as educationalists, as leaders of SEN, what might be some of the things that we can think about and consider, because it's so difficult to know, what the future is going to hold for us. Certainly there's two things that I think we need to draw on and be a little bit sort of more committed to. The first one is that commitment to evidence, and we need to, I think, get better than that as leaders of SEN in our schools. And sometimes committing to that evidence, is hard, isn't it? When we look at, for example, some of the research on the effective use of teaching assistants, and actually we know the importance of liaison time and that sort of preparation time, in order for those teaching assistants to work with teachers in classrooms. Actually, going into classroom, into schools, actually quite rarely do you see that sort of commitment there. So committing to evidence is going to be one, and then really prioritising leadership of SEN in our schools if we're going to, ensure that all children in our schools, including those with SEN, really are going to make the progress that they should be. So not paying lip service to that, but actually really being a sort of a golden thread that runs through our work in terms of our SEN provision in our schools. A couple of sort of examples I mentioned about, doing a few things well. I work quite closely with a great colleague of mine, Mark Rowland, and he's just released this book called Addressing Educational Disadvantage, and a couple of pieces of research that was in there from work that had been done in Oldham and Derby. And what Mark looked at was that when it looked at outcomes for disadvantaged groups, there wasn't actually a great deal of difference in the things that schools were doing. What really defined the schools that were struggling when it came to really good outcomes for those disadvantaged groups was that they were actually doing too many things at once. So this doing a few things well and really trying to prioritise the key things for your school and what they should be, we're going to come to a little bit later. The image on the left-hand side, a lot of people don't know who he is, but this is Matt Parker. He was the brains behind the Olympic cycling success. And Matt Parker introduced something called marginal gains. So rather than making huge, great changes to the British cycling team and their work, he actually looked at the very small things that the British cycling team could do in order to ensure success. So, for example, I believe he made sure that the wheels of the British cycling team were perfectly round, and he reckoned it saved 0.004 of a second. And I believe they're all using. He knew the importance of sleep, and they were using NASA pillows, and he reckoned it saved 0.00 something of a second. But it was when you put all of these tiny, tiny things together that actually, when you stood back, you saw that sort of significant improvement. So sometimes, it's about not doing big, shiny interventions. Yes, they can have their place, but just that attention to detail in terms of our work as leaders of SEN, and just making some of those, small shifts. It's not necessarily about huge, great TA restructures or new SEN policies. Actually, we'd just be doing a small few things in terms of shifting our current approach, certainly in terms of what I've seen and with regards to some of the schools that I've worked with. I wish I'd had a model, to work from when I was sort of assistant head and Senko in a big school in the west of London, and I remember making so many mistakes in my first year. So I'm going to share with you just a model briefly that I think is worth considering. And sometimes people put models up in front of me, and I can switch off sort of quite quickly. But I just want you to bear with me for a moment, because it's not based at all actually on SEN or even education, but it's a leadership model by a guy called Steve Radcliffe, and I know Andy Buck has done a lot of this work in terms of drawing on this as a model in terms of education. And I also felt it's really quite helpful when we think about our leadership of SEN in schools and trying to ensure that then we use that leadership model to really see and drive forward support and improvement for all of our kids with SEN. So it talks about doing three things well as leaders, whether you're a Senko or a leader of SEN in your schools. It talks about three aspects to do three things really, really well if we're going to ensure great leadership. So the first one is really knowing what our vision is, what it is that we want to change about the past, and then what evidence is that based upon. So as a leader in our area, just being really clear on, the future of where we want to go and where we're headed, and having a strategic plan around that. The second aspect around ensuring sort of great leadership of provision in this area would be thinking about how we're engaging and building and sustaining relationships with our stakeholders. And if we think about that in the world of SEN, how we're getting that collective buy-in, that will be our pupils, that will be our parents, it would be our teaching assistants, our outside agencies, and that looks really, really different, doesn't it, in different schools. So no school's perfect in terms of how it's engaging and working with those particular groups. And then the third strand is actually thinking about how we're going to deliver our vision. So how we're going to work with others to get things done. It's all very well, being all motivational and a great speaker and being able to inspire people to go in the right direction. But actually, it's also important that we have the systems and the processes in place to ensure that we take our staff and our colleagues with us as part of that. And also to ensure that the quality of what we're delivering is high. So in the world of SEN and our sort of SEN or learning difference departments, that may be, for example, provision mapping, that might be assessment, and approaches to assessment and identification. It might be referral forms, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a bad model for us to think about. And as we go through the presentation, what I'm going to be drawing on will be those three key areas. So I'm going to split the presentation now into, so in terms of the vision bit, what do we do? In terms of engagement, what does that really look like in practice? And then just briefly touch on the delivery part, which is, what might be some of the systems and processes in place in order to support us first. But remembering that, the research as well, tells us that when we think about having a clear and ambitious vision for where we want to go, actually powerful and effective leaders really often guided by the future that they want. So, the leader often is strongest when the future is powerfully connected by what he or she cares about. So actually, if you're thinking about the reasons why you came into this area of SEN, it's probably not by accident. And actually, the most effective SENCOs, leaders of SEN in schools, certainly are those that have something that, often personally has absolutely driven them, or that they really genuinely care about. So why do we need to commit to the evidence part? And you'll see that on that first vision future bit. It was, being clear on your vision, but also committing to evidence. Why is that important for us in our work as leaders of SEN? Well, we don't have a lot of time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges and impact of COVID on us as professionals. Leading SEN provision in schools is hard anyway, isn't it? It just got harder when it came to the challenges over the last year, and also some of the challenges that will be included around that transition back into school, which is, I'm going to draw a little bit on the research on that shortly. And vulnerable pupils already been, impacted by lockdown. So we really need to ensure that, what we're doing is evidence-based, that actually does have the greatest impact on our pupils. So I'm going to spend, if it's okay, about 10 minutes with you just drawing on some research from the UK that I think also is relevant for other colleagues as well, listening in more internationally. And asking, so when we think about the return to school at the moment and that transition back into school, we know the challenges around transition for vulnerable learners. What's the evidence actually saying about the experience of children through lockdown at the moment? And this report, which you can go and Google quite simply, by Impact Ed, built on the experience of more than 60,000 pupils in England, and they've been surveyed, monitored and interviewed over approximately an 8-month period, and it makes it so the largest pupil-facing research project into the impact of the pandemic in the UK. So I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes through the 5 findings, and then explore that a little bit more. Okay. So first finding was that despite concerns that pupil wellbeing was going to really drop following the move to remote learning in March 2020 and sort of continue to fall as this period was extended, research was indicating that wellbeing remains remarkably stable on average. So although lockdown, clearly a challenge for many pupils and their families, also what the focus groups were highlighting was that actually there were many positive experiences for pupils and families as well. So for example, pupils noting that time away from the physical classroom had been actually quite a good opportunity to build bonds with parents. And in some cases, lockdown had provided opportunity for families to have deeper conversations about mental health, reflect on shared challenges and so on. And some pupils even, as part of the research, it was noted that they felt it had contributed to better communication with their families and members before. So that sort of first key recommendation was really to focus on, as our children are coming back, the positive individual experiences as well as the challenges, and that actually targeted approaches to well-being are probably going to be more beneficial than sort of universal blanket stuff, making sort of assumptions around our children, those children that would have found it difficult and otherwise. Really important that doesn't mask sort of important differences in the experience of lockdown linked to demographic characteristics such as gender, economic disadvantage. So pupils with SEN, for example, they did report greater challenges with learning and overall well-being in lockdown, but actually it hadn't deteriorated over time and actually been quite stable. So by no means sort of a universal picture either. And then on returning to school, autumn 2020, over 27% of pupils wanted dedicated, only 22% rather, of pupils wanting dedicated wellbeing time rather than normal teaching. Actually, what they did want was, kids going back have wanted to know what school will be like in advance in terms of that support around transition, and then not too much pressure to catch up, if you like. Okay. So second theme, what did they find? Well, on average, disadvantaged pupils gave their home learning environment a score which was over 6% poorer compared to their peers. So students eligible for pupil premium, for example, were less likely to have developed a routine for learning, less likely to be able to get help from their family, less likely to understand the work that had been set. So the recommendation here was to ensure that learners from economically disadvantaged backgrounds really benefited. And if not, just to absolutely scrap them. Why have I sort of like drawn on that disadvantaged theme, when essentially this is around SEN, presentation. We know nationally in England, for example, the overlap between SEN and disadvantage and poverty. So just pulled out some of the latest statistics for you here from the Department for Education, which shows that children with EHCPs, 34% of children with EHCPs are eligible for free school meals against the national average of 17%. And even children at SEN support, so 29.9%. So a third of children with SEN eligible for free school meals. So we know that local overlap, but also we know the global relationship between poverty and SEN. So many pupils with SEN, for example, particularly in development countries, often poor attendance, fewer educational opportunities. So learning difference linked to poverty, knowing that learning difference may increase the risk of poverty, and poverty may increase the risk of learning difference. And sometimes, quite often, little incentives in many countries to actually welcome pupils with learning difference into schools, seen as a burden or an anchor to school standards in some parts of the world. And we can perhaps explore that a little bit later on. Strand 3. So during the lockdown, Key Stage 4 pupils reported particular challenges with home learning. So nearly 3 in every 20 pupils in this age group said they really didn't understand the work. So a lot of the time when we're speaking with colleagues, we thought that it would be children in year 9. So for international colleagues, that's often sort of like 13, 14. But actually it's our sort of children at the age of 15 or 16 that were reporting some of their greater challenges in terms of what they were experiencing at home. And similarly, the most likely age group to report that they were unable to get support with their work was that sort of 15, 16-year-old age group, with 1 of 4 pupils saying that they couldn't get help from their family. Strand 4 has some considerations for us around anxiety. And if we look at the SEN register in England, we have approximately around about 1 million pupils on the SEN register, with 64% of those being boys. So actually boys are sort of overrepresented in some of those figures. But it was girls that were reporting greater levels of anxiety around that return to school. So nearly 1/3 of girls were worried about returning to school, which almost doubled the percentage of male pupils. Throughout the overall duration of the research project, girls reported higher levels of anxiety than boys by an average of over 10%. And you'll just see from that graph there, mirrored in sort of lower wellbeing scores, so 6% poorer for girls than boys, may partly be a result of the fact that girls were more likely to think about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their education. And in contrast, boys were more likely to say that they had someone to talk to and that they understood the schoolwork that they were set. So reflecting on that as sort of educators and considering that in terms of that transition, just being aware of some of that research, I think, might be of interest, of help to us. And then the final strand, before we start to pick up more specifically on some of these SEN themes, is really critical, which identified the risk of lost children. That actually those pupils who had struggled the most over the last year were not always those previously identified as vulnerable. So the recommendation here really was very much about gathering data on individuals rather than making any assumptions. The importance of looking at children as individuals. This particular slide, I often think people put them up because and they make up answers like this because they want to get a few sort of likes on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be. If you have a look to the answers to this particular question, I know this one is real because it happens to be my daughter's answer to her year 1 maths assessment. And she looked very individual, I suppose, in terms of her approach to this particular question. And just a reminder, I think, about the value in looking at our children as absolutely individuals and seeing past labels. Just one last slide as I draw on some of that research. So this figure shows that in general as well, pupils attending primary schools were more excited about returning than those attending secondary schools. So really quite interesting to see the sort of those dark bars over the left-hand side and showing the sort of how much, how pupils were looking forward to going back to school, and how that was represented. Huge sort of, like, if you like, overrepresented in terms of the primary sector. But there was also interesting here is this huge sort of variation between schools, isn't there? So over 80% of the pupils were excited about returning in one secondary school. This one over on the left-hand side there, that sort of lighter bar, really fascinating to see actually what was it that that secondary school was doing so differently to so many of those others towards the right-hand side. So I've talked a little bit about, the evidence and the research around the return to school and vulnerable groups, and some things for us to consider as part of this work. And now I was just going to draw on, well, what does the evidence tell us about sort of best practice in SEN provision, essentially. And right at the start of lockdown, there was a report that came out by the Education Endowment Foundation. And some of it was almost sort of lost, essentially, because of everything that was going on at the moment. And I put a link on there for you, and I know that you will be able to, there's a few slides coming up with some smaller levels of detail on it, but I know that you can sort of look at the video back and freeze this and take up some of the links and detail a little bit later, if that's helpful for you. But I just wanted to draw on the 5 findings so that we can think about as leaders of SEN, and when we're leading SEN provision in schools, some of the core things that we can consider perhaps going forward. And the 5 key strands, the 5 key recommendations of this work, I've just highlighted for you there, and just picked out some interesting small sort of statements really down the bottom. So strand 1 was around creating a positive and supportive environment, and actually this proactive approach to behaviour. EF around best practice around SEN provision was saying the second strand is around understanding our pupil learning needs. So again, it ties in with that sort of high quality assessment and identification, and really being precise around understanding the needs of the children in our classrooms. Strand 3, which is really key, we're going to come on to that in just a moment, is ensuring all pupils have access to really high quality teaching. And it talks about sort of forgetting magic bullets, not going for some sort of, mystical answer. We've managed to make the delivery of SEN provision, I think, incredibly complicated over the years. And often it's about going in as leaders of SEN and not going in with lots of new strategies or approaches, but noticing the things that our teachers are doing in classrooms that are working for our children, and sharing that more widely in our schools. Number 4 is using targeted and evidence-based interventions, rather than those interventions that have sat in the cupboard or evolved over time, really. And then number 5 is the importance of working effectively with our teaching assistant team. And I know my personal experience as a teaching assistant, how differently you're used by teachers, and the importance of teachers really understanding how best to get the most out of you as a teaching assistant and as a colleague. So I'm just going to talk a little bit through some of those, and start with number 1, which is sort of that creation of an inclusive culture, if you like. And it's going to link us to, after looking at the future part and that evidence part, it's going to link us to the engagement strand of that initial diagram that I showed you. So we've done a little bit on sort of vision and thinking about the future, and drawing on the evidence to inform our strategic approach. And then the second strand is, okay, so if we're now starting to think about our engagement and engaging with our stakeholders and who we should be engaging with and why, this is that second strand that I'm going to draw on. And as we go through, I'll be picking up on bits of that EEF report as well. Okay. I've pinched a lot of Mark Rowland as part of this presentation and his work, because he's someone who's visited so many schools and really seen what things look like on the ground. And why is it important for us to really start to focus on high quality teaching in the classroom? Actually, it's highlighted here, I think, because Mark talks about our vulnerable learners as being, if you like, the canaries in the coal mine. And for those of you that know that sort of analogy, will know that the miners took canaries down the coal mine because actually they were the first ones to suffer, if you like, when there were poisonous gases down in the coal mines. And certainly in my experience and Mark's experience of going into schools, where things are starting to go wrong in schools, often it's our vulnerable learners, including sometimes our children with SEN, that are first to suffer within that. So what do I mean, by things starting to go wrong? So, I'll often see poor outcomes for children with learning difference and SEN in schools where there is very high turnover in leadership within the team, both at a senior leadership level and SEN department level, or actually where there is really poor quality teaching. And research from the Sutton Trust supported that fact, showing the difference that teachers, a high quality teacher against poor teaching can make on our vulnerable groups. The government recently appointed a sort of a catch-up czar, Kevin Collins, and he talks quite rightly, Kevin, about the importance of high quality teaching in the classroom, that the best intervention for catch-up is always really going to be to provide children with the highest quality teaching. And he says that's why everything that we do going forward must be underpinned by this commitment to support our teachers to be the best they can be. And my concern often within the sort of the SEN context sometimes is our danger of overcomplicating our approach can very quickly feel that one of our most precious resource, our classroom teachers, will start to feel that, actually you have to be some sort of absolute expert to teach children with SEN in your classrooms, or worse, it then becomes somebody else's problems. So how can schools achieve this focus on really high quality teaching? Some key themes that came out again from the EF around the research on that. So evidence in the EF guidance report focused on said that teachers should develop a repertoire of strategies that they can use flexibly in response to individual needs and use them as a starting point for classroom teaching for all pupils, but including those with SEN. And again, you can pick that up from the report, and it covers these 5 areas. So scaffolding, such as writing frames as temporary support, explicit instruction, detailed teacher explanation followed by extensive practice, use of technology, and we know that can benefit many children with SEN in classrooms, cognitive strategies and metacognitive strategies, chunking work and so on, and then also flexible grouping. And there's a summary across each of those 5 areas that sort of explains that in a little bit more detail. And I think what's really important is that all of this we talk about in terms of some of those strategies and some of that approach, that vision, is really built on a foundation of really high expectations and what that looks like, in practice. And it's one of those phrases, isn't it, that gets sort of overused a lot of the time. Everybody thinks that they've got great expectations of kids, or thinks they're an inclusive school. I've never gone into a school and said to a head teacher, have you got high expectations of the children with SEN in your school? And they said, no, David, I don't think this lot can achieve anything. Like, everyone thinks they've got really high expectations. But, what does that look like in practice when we're walking into our classrooms, for example, walking around? What does that look like? Interestingly, I went into, say, the top set science and the bottom set science of not that long ago of a classroom in a particular school. And in the top set, all the kids were working right to the bell. And in the bottom set, kids had their coats on for the last 5 minutes, simple things like that. Or a school in the sort of Oxfordshire region once that I went into, and they had consistently poor outcomes for children with SEN in maths. And wanted me as part of the review to go in and have a little bit of a look at that. And interestingly, when we went into the school, every single bottom set was taught by a teaching assistant without a qualification in maths. And when I said to challenge the head teacher as part of the feedback around that, say, I'm sure about the quality of your, I'm sure about your expectations here and whether they're high enough for these kids in terms of, the staff that are delivering that session. Head teacher was quite a little bit offended by it and said, what did you think of the lesson? We think she's really good. I said, it doesn't matter really what I think. The outcomes are poor each year, but also if she was that good, why not put her into the top set? Oh no, I wouldn't do that. So in terms of what expectations really look like, and challenging ourselves around that, actually it's a great opportunity also just to get out and have a look in classrooms and see what that looks like in practice. Mark, this is very lucky that he wrote a section in the book that I put together called Great Expectations. Obviously, I didn't pinch that title off anyone, but talks about the importance of, losing limiting labels. I did a review for a school in the Midlands once, and I got all of the kids round and said to them, asked them about who they were and what they did. And one of the kids said to me, he said, yeah, my name's Noah and I'm an oof. And I said, what's an oof? No, and he said, out of French. And I said, oh, right, so what do you do when you're out of French? He said, I just spend a lot of time. It's great. There's about 12 of us in a classroom. We get to do stuff that's not French and, and play a few games and stuff like that. And actually, it was the kids that had picked up on the language that staff had been using. As Mark says, thinking about when we're talking, using terms like low ability and so on, what that really means. Where would you put yourself in terms of ability levels, and what does it really mean anyway? Mo Farah is a low ability shot putter. So the importance of sort of getting out, I think, into class and really seeing what is going on in practice. I did a piece of work with Salford City Academy in the Manchester region. I'm sure they were, you might be saying, for a while there was some some challenges around outcomes for children with SEN there. Fantastic Senko led this work, very little to do with me in terms of those improvements, but actually Danielle went out and really started to not just hand out advice to staff on how they should be working with kids with, a particular area of need, but actually going out and having a look in practice at what that looked like in the classroom and working alongside teachers to both support and challenge whether they were using just very simple, straightforward, achievable strategies that everybody would use. So thinking about our stakeholders and our teachers from that point of view, a key theme to consider. And really critically reflecting on practice and our language. And the reason I put this particular slide up is around often the challenges that I find when I go into a school and have to spend the first sort of hour understanding the SEN setup and how it works. I said before, about the only thing I know anything about is the delivery of SEN provision in schools, really. And if it takes me, as I suppose an SEN specialist, an hour or so really to work out what is going on, can you imagine how challenging that could be sometimes for our stakeholders, like our pupils, our parents, and so on. So if we're thinking about stakeholders, considering that, what do I mean? To give you like a practical example. So even when we talk about learning support assistants, LSAs, teaching assistants, inclusion support workers, learning mentors, a lot of these can look hugely, be called lots of different names, perceived differently depending on the school that you're in or working within. And we love to make things complicated in terms of our language in SEN, don't we, as well? I mean, even when we're talking about quality first teaching, what's it really mean? It's about good teaching, isn't it? Or the graduated response. Actually, this is about just ensuring that our provision is as balanced as possible in terms of our work. And when we talk to the kids and we think about the stakeholders and we get feedback from them, so often it's not complicated what they're asking for and what they need. This was a school in Weston-super-Mare that I was discussing with around what they felt could be improved in terms of the way teachers work with them. So a group of kids with SEN that I spoke to, and I said, what would make the biggest difference? And it wasn't actually necessarily lots of resource or extra time. Actually, it was around teacher instruction. And this one pupil saying sometimes you just need things explained a bit better, a bit slower, using words that are less complicated. And then another pupil, I agree, just a little bit more patient rather than saying, but I've already explained it. So actually, sometimes, it can be the simple things that we need to happen. And then, of course, our stakeholders are also, our teaching assistants as part of that group, and really trying to draw on what the evidence tells us about best practice in terms of our teaching assistant work. And there are lots of different resources out there to support them with that. I've put a link on there for you. There's lots of different review guides and everything out at the moment, but this one I've really highlighted because there's a great, really simple framework within there written by Rob Webster, who talks about or provides opportunities for us to reflect on our practice when it comes to high quality TA deployment. And there's also some brilliant at the back questionnaires that allow us to at least go some way to measure the impact of our teaching assistants and their work, and how we can develop and improve those further. And so if that particular link will take you to the back of that, and using those very, very simply, because it can be hard on it sometimes to evidence that impact directly, but there's a really good simple structure at the back there for colleagues to be able to access and use. And then just really the last sort of like 5 minutes or so from me is that third strand, which is around delivery. So we've looked at that future part and vision, and drawing on, research linked to our own context to support us inform our strategic approach. Then that second strand, we've touched on stakeholders and the importance of a focus on high quality teaching in the classroom, but also, engaging with our parents and our pupils, our wider community, and also teaching assistants. So the third bit really is around, are there systems and processes that are going to enable us to ensure that our provision is of high quality, that our leadership is strong, so that all pupils are able to progress under our care. So thinking about how are we going to ensure we're going to get things done, what are the systems that need to be in place, and then also thinking about how we develop our team potentially going forward. So again, linking back to the evidence around the EEF guidance, I think it's a helpful framework to think about. There's that building an ongoing holistic understanding of pupils and their needs, and that's that sort of high quality identification, which is key. And then the third strand, we'll get our slide moving. Here we go. I think hopefully we're back. Sorry, Kat, don't know if you can still hear me.
Are you back on, David? Yeah, I can hear you now. I think we just lost you.
Oh, great. Apologies. Yep, you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, yeah.
Just great. Just quick gremlin, apologies for that. So one was around identification, and then that other drawing on 4, which was around the importance of high quality intervention as well. Okay. And so there's a UK spectrum of SEN. Said sometimes, there can feel like a pressure on us as SEN leads to know all of this, but I feel sometimes we're like the conductors of an orchestra, that actually it's about how we, bring together our team to support us in terms of the delivery around some of this support. About how we can structure that sometimes in terms of the 4 broad areas of SEN. So I've just a very sort of simple provision map for schools to think about in terms of just mapping what their provision looks like across those 4 broad areas of need. So cognition, learning, communication, interaction, you'll see down the left-hand side. And then what is our offer as a school, our strategic offer in terms of what's happening in the classroom, then at a group level, and then at an individual level. And I know that will be difficult for colleagues to see, but when you go back, hopefully look at the video, you'll be able to take a clip of that and just see this was a school that populated in each of those particular areas. So they're those 4 broad areas of need. The next slide I'm going to show you, again, a little bit small in terms of detail, but you'll be able to go back and look at the video and pull some of this out, which is assessments across the 4 broad areas of need. So really helpful sometimes to think about in terms of our strategy in those 4 broad areas of need. What is our offer for all kids in the school, and mapping that at a strategic level? And then how do we assess across those 4 broad areas of need? And there's a whole range of often free assessments that are available there that I've put on for you that you can link on and that you will be able to access. And there's also some strategic tools out there at the moment to support you as well. So a couple that I've been involved in working with over the last couple of years. One of it is around how you evaluate the quality of your SEN provision. using self-evaluation. So there's a particular link on for you there. And then also around Provision Map as a provision mapping tool, seen some really impressive work around how you really capture impact of and track and monitor the effectiveness of your provision across those particular areas. Okay, so we have more or less, I think we're more or less finishing on time and open up potentially for some questions, but I wanted to finish on this slide for colleagues, because I think it sort of really captures the essence of what it is that we need to be focusing on and thinking about as leaders of SEN. Every time I go into a school, I always do a pupil panel. So I get the kids together and I ask them, what they feel about the impact that the provision has had on them and the difference that the help that they've had has made to them. And this particular girl, this was a school in the north of England, happened to be a school in what's called special measures. So it had some real difficulties around its sort of outcomes in many ways. And it had been criticised for, I think, the lack of impact that some of its teaching assistant staff had. And when I asked this particular girl, or that group of pupils, about the difference that the support was making to them, this girl said, before, I didn't eat because I didn't want to be on this earth. But in this school, the teaching assistant sat down next to me and listened to why I didn't want to eat. We ate together at lunchtime, and now I eat every day. And I think it was this most amazing bit of impact that perhaps had been lost in terms of the hecticness of everything that we do and the pressures on us as leaders of SEN at the moment. Actually, the importance of relationships and knowing our children as individuals, and actually the difference that just spending time with children can make. So I hope there was some useful things in that presentation for colleagues to be able to take away. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. So many ideas, things to consider, sort of starting points and development points for everybody in schools. So now we will answer, we've got a bit of time before the end of the session to answer some questions. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box and I'll put them to David. And I've got a few already that we're ready to go with. So in terms of support and development, David, the opportunity to kind of work with others. Are you with us? Oh, we might have lost David. There. Oh, can you hear us? Are you there, David?
I'm back, sorry, yeah. It's the pleasures of
no, it's
online webinars. Apologies for that, sorry.
No, that's fine. It's everybody sort of using the internet, isn't it? It's the wonders of virtual sessions. But so in terms of one of the first questions, in terms of working with others, and we know that sort of sharing best practice and getting the opportunities, how would you sort of suggest to people or seeing examples of excellent practice or practical examples of great SEN leadership?
So where would you go, or how do you go about sort of finding
them?
I mean, certainly, like, there's opportunities to draw on. So in England, we'll have, like, Senko networks and so on as well. I think in terms of your own local authority, that are really important. I'm doing some really interesting work with whole education at the moment that looks at how we can pull together communities of SEN practice across local authorities as well. I think Adam Bodiston speaking later on from NASEN and the SEND Gateway. I think there's some really helpful, useful resources on that site to sort of signpost schools and colleagues and some examples of that. And I've seen, on my travels, some, fantastic provision right across the country. So probably give a shout out to a few colleagues. I mean, Sarah Marks in Hull, Kingswood Academy, fantastic outcomes year on year that they have, and with this real absolute focus on sort of getting it right in the classroom, which is absolutely, which has been a real pleasure to see. Eleanor Palmer Primary School in Camden, in London, and also Charles Dickens, one of the research schools in London. Some great examples there of the evidence. And the Peak Edge mat example.
Oh, I'm just thinking we might have lost David again. I'll just give it a minute to see if he can come back. I can see we have got some questions coming in, so do pop your questions. And if we can't get David back, then you know, we will try and get those questions answered for you as soon as possible. I'm very hopeful. I can see people saying they're hoping that David will be able to come back. So just bear with us. If we hopefully. We'll give it one more minute, and then if not, we may have to leave it there until he can make it back. But what I will do is, if there are any other questions, do pop them in the Q&A, and I will ask for the information to be sent out via email, and we will ask David to respond to those questions. So please do feel free to put things in the Q&A box, and as I say, I will ask for those things to be collated. I think we may. I was hoping we might have got David to come back. I will give it just one more minute, and if not, we are still within our time, so do bear with us. I suppose that's the beauty of virtual webinars now. No. I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to make comments in the chat box. We can have. I know I've seen a question coming in about educational technology landscape and around quality first teaching examples and places to go. As I say, we will get David to respond to those and put the information within one of our virtual booths. If you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at our knowledge hubs, we do have a SEN knowledge hub, which has a range of videos and blogs and downloadable content that is a great starting point for anybody who's interested in the sort of field of SEN and supporting young people with SEN. So there is that knowledge hub. And as David did mention, we do have the CEO of NASON, Adam Bodinson, who is doing a talk tomorrow afternoon around the sort of SEN landscape at the moment and updates. I'm not sure we're going to get David back, unfortunately. So do join us for the talk tomorrow in terms of NASON, and then within 24 to 48 hours of this session, you will receive your attendee pack, which will contain a recording of the session, a certificate of attendance, and also a short survey. So if I could ask you to take a moment of your time to complete that survey, as the results really do help us to make improvements, ensure that we can continue to deliver interesting, useful and topical events in the future. We also do have another session running after this one at 5:45, which is about getting COVID ready, getting COVID recovery right for children, families and providers. So that session is being led by Panima Tanaku, the OBE, who is the Chief Executive of NDNA, and she's going to be discussing the importance of investment in early years for children's outcomes, but also for economic recovery as people do return to the workplace. So you will also have full access to the EduSummit content on demand for 3 months. So as David was saying within his talk, if there is content within the slides, you will have the opportunity to go back and watch it again. And thank you very much for attending today's session. As I say, I will make sure that the questions are captured and that we do collate some responses to those questions from David, the expert himself. So thank you very much for attending today, and hopefully we'll see you joining us for another session.